In this video, we're going to be diving deep into the Sony a7S III, but first I want to thank our sponsor, AC/DC's Gemstone Photo Editor 12. If you're looking for a way to edit those raw files, but you don't want to spend a monthly fee with Adobe or learn new, really complicated software, definitely check out Gemstone Photo Editor 12. This software is incredibly powerful. It can do many of the things photographers need from Adobe programs and more. And best of all, it is significantly cheaper. If you hate being locked into monthly fees, you can purchase this software one time for $80 and have it for life. But don't take my word for it and don't spend any money right now. Head over to the link in the description. You can check out the software 100% for free today. Hey guys, welcome to our a7S III introductory video. Nothing in this video is going to be groundbreaking or anything that you can't find if you went through page by page in the manual and tested everything out for yourself, or went through hundreds of YouTube videos like I did. But as someone who recently moved over to Sony, man, it took me a long time to learn this camera. And finally, now that I feel like I have a really good handle on it, I feel like this is by far the best video camera I've ever used, probably the best hybrid camera I've ever used. But man, if you come from another system, or maybe you're a still photographer and you're not accustomed to shooting video, there's so many little details with this camera that take so long to figure out, just surfing through YouTube videos trying to find these answers. So basically, in this video, I want to pack in every single question that I had when I bought this camera, and hopefully I can teach you how to use it as quickly as possible. Now, the first thing you need to do before we get started is you need to update the firmware on your camera. I know just a few days ago, as I'm filming this, Sony released a big update. So make sure you go to the README file that came along with this footage, and you can go to the link on Sony's website, download the file, plug in the camera to the computer, run the software, update everything, and then you'll be ready to go. Now, this camera is one of the most customizable cameras ever. And I came from Nikon. I don't think I ever customized a single button on my Nikon cameras. I never felt like I needed to, maybe one or two, like exposure lock or something. With this camera, you'll notice there are C buttons all over the place. And in some cases, the C buttons are set to do certain things right out of the box. I don't think they're set very well. And of course, because they say C and they don't actually tell you what they are, you're gonna find yourself poking around and trying to just, guess what it's going to do until you actually hit the button. It's worth putting in the time and customizing the camera to the way that you want it. And it's gonna take a little bit of time to get used to it. It's also frustrating picking up someone else's camera whose buttons are mapped a little bit differently. But try not to get frustrated. If you put a little bit of time in and really go through the menu and set up the camera the way that you want it, I think this will become one of the most intuitive cameras to use, but you have to make it that way. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on in this video. Now, there's one other problem that I recently ran into as I was preparing to make this video. There's a new menu system with this camera that is infinitely better than any other Sony camera that I've used in the past. It's so intuitive now. And one of the things that you can do is you can save and load camera settings. So I have multiple a7S IIIs. I was hoping that I could save my settings and then give them to you. And what you do, you go down to the briefcase, go down to number 2, reset and save settings, and then you can save and load settings, and I can go to save, and you can see I've done this many times, and I can hit save new. It's gonna save as number 06, and I'm going to click OK. And now what I should be able to do is go and click load, and then go down to 6. This is what we just saved, and if I click OK, it says this file cannot be loaded. This is some sort of bug. It has something to do with some setting that I have recently set in this camera. This camera is literally brand new. I opened it yesterday and this was working perfectly until I went in and started messing with some settings. I've called Sony, and hopefully this bug will be fixed later. I'm going to give you one of these save files. You can drop it on a memory card, put it in your camera. You can try to load it. Maybe by the time you're watching this, they will have fixed this bug. But if they don't, and if you get this same error, don't worry about it. I think you'll probably learn your camera better if you follow along with me right now, and we can kind of go through the menu, and I'll tell you how I set up my camera, and then you can choose if you want to do it like me, or maybe you want to make some changes of your own. Before we get into customizing the menu, Let me quickly explain the way settings work on this camera. Up top here, you'll notice that we have the standard mode dial, and we have auto, which I don't think I would ever use. We have program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, manual. You're probably accustomed to that if you're coming from another camera. We have video mode, which I'm currently in right now. S and Q mode, which is slow and quick. This allows you to shoot time lapses or slow-mo and then play that footage back either faster or slower baked into the file. I only use this feature for time lapses, so I'll shoot maybe 1 frame per second and then it will speed up in the final video. I don't use it for slow-mo because I'd rather shoot in a high frame rate and then edit those files afterwards. And then we have 1, 2, and 3, and you can customize those to do whatever you want. So many videographers might set 1 to 24 frames per second, and 2 to 60 frames, and 3 to 120 frames per second, something like that. It lets you quickly change settings. I personally have not used those because we have multiple cameras and we have people shooting with them and stuff. So usually I'm telling people to like go in the menu and just double check settings before we shoot. Again, if this is your only camera and this is you, I'm going to show you how to customize those in a second, but I haven't done it. The reason why I wanted to start off by talking about this mode dial is because all of the buttons on the camera can be customized to the current mode you're in. If you're in a shooting mode like auto, PASM, and then you move into the video mode, you can either have all the buttons remain the exact same, or you can have all the buttons completely change and do something different. Obviously, I don't think you want all of the buttons to change, but there are buttons that you'll use all the time with still photography that you will never use with video, and vice versa. And so for that reason, I have changed a few of the buttons to do different things when I'm in video mode versus when I'm in stills mode. Also, when you're in playback mode, when you hit the play button down here and you're reviewing images or video or whatever, the buttons can change again, and you can come in and customize that as well. So just so you understand that, let's go ahead and jump in the menu. I'm not going to go through every single thing. We could be here all day, but I'm just going to go through some of the stuff that I think is most important for you. We'll start up at the very top, which is this My Menu star setting up here. And I highly suggest you guys set this up for the features that you are always trying to find in the menu. One of those features being the format feature, where you format the memory card. I'm always hunting for that in camera, so I always put that right at the top if I can. The way that you customize this menu is by going back into My Menu Settings and then Add Item. And basically you can come back in here and go through the entire menu, choose whatever you want. If I wanted to do WPS push and I wanted to save that, I just click the center button right here. And then I can put it in any one of the My Menus. I'll put it in the second one here. It's going to go right below the interval shooting. And then I can go back and I could sort items if I wanted to. So if I go down to My Menu 2, that's where I just put this. If I wanted to move this on top, I could click it now. You can see here I've highlighted that, and now when I hit up and down, it gives me the option to move it above or below interval shooting function, which is the only other thing that I put in that menu. If I want to delete an item, I can do the exact same thing. I'm going to go down to My Menu 2, and I'm going to delete this. So let's quickly look at some of the things that I put in My Menu here. First of all, file format. This is going to be what type of image file I'm taking. Right now it's set to JPEG. Obviously, if you're a still photographer, you'd want this set to RAW. You may be wondering why it's grayed out right now, and that's because I am in the movie mode up here. So if I set this to manual, and then I go back into the menu, you'll see that now I can actually read this, and it is set to RAW and JPEG there. So this is what's a little confusing about this camera, but once you get used to it, it does make sense. The menu itself will change, and some things will become available or grayed out depending on what mode you're in up here. So if something isn't showing up correctly, check your mode and it may make a little bit more sense. I'm gonna go back into video mode here. The next thing that I have is file format for video. I'm always checking this and sometimes changing it. I'm going to make this really simple for you videographers out there. If you want the absolute highest quality, the a7sIII is going to be the best quality footage. However, the problem with this footage is that the files are massive. It will actually play back and edit more easily on your computer, but it's going to eat up your memory cards, and of course it's going to eat up your hard drives back on your computer. So I personally don't shoot that very often. Obviously, if I was going to be shooting a really important project, sure, shoot the highest quality possible. The other option here is HAVCS, which is another 4K option. Obviously, the HD options are 1080. 4K is probably what you're going to want. I shoot in this option the most, even though it's not the highest quality. And obviously, some people get really mad at that. But I mean, I'm shooting lots of YouTube videos and tutorials and stuff. I guarantee you, no one can tell the difference for the stuff that I'm shooting. It really just doesn't matter. Now, XAVC HS 4K is an H.265 codec. So basically you're able to get much higher quality video footage in a smaller file, which sounds incredible. I personally in the past ran into some issues with this codec. It was doing some weird things in my Adobe Premiere. It was like creating 1/3 of the frame blurry. I don't know if that's been fixed with the update or not. It just kind of spooked me personally, so I don't use it. I jump between the S and the SI version. Next up, movie settings. This is something that I'm changing all the time. First thing, frame rate. Almost all of our projects are in 24 frames per second, but sometimes we're shooting a much higher frame rate for options later. Sometimes we'll shoot everything in 60 frames per second, create a 24 frames per second timeline, and then we'll just have the option to slow our footage down if we want to in post. Are there frame drops and all this stuff? Maybe. Again, nobody can see it. I think so many YouTubers out there, they do this crazy pixel peeping stuff and they say you have to shoot in this file format and this frame rate and it has to be this way or footage is gonna look horrible, and that's just not true. 99% of what makes your footage look good is your lighting, okay? So focus on your lighting. This type of stuff really isn't that big a deal. Next up, recording settings. This is where we can jump between 8-bit and 10-bit. 10-bit is going to give you many more colors. It's also going to make the file sizes much larger, and it can make things a little bit harder for your computer to edit. If you're going to be doing lots of color grading, and if you're going to be shooting in S-Log, you definitely want to be filming in 10-bit. 422 is supposed to give better color sampling when it comes to the actual image creation inside the camera. I've seen tons of tests done, and maybe it's a little bit better. I can't see it. So for me personally, it's not worth bogging down my computer with 422. So I usually shoot 420. You can also go back here and you'll see that if we jump over to the HS option, our movie settings will change here. So we can drop this back to 24 frames per second, but you can see that each one of these is a 10-bit option here. And these numbers here, the 30, 50, and 100, that is your bit rate. So that's how much data it's actually using up every second to create this video file. For this video right now, don't kill me, but I am shooting in HVAC-S. I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, and I am shooting in 420 8-bit at 100 megabits per second. Like I mentioned earlier, the format, I'm always formatting memory cards, so I want that easily accessible. S&Q settings, this is gonna make it really easy if I want to shoot a time lapse or something like that. Proxy settings, I haven't used this yet, but I actually do use proxies all the time with the computer. Basically, the camera can shoot a high-res video and a low-res video at the exact same time. And then if your computer is struggling to edit the footage quickly, you can use Premiere or other editing programs and you can point the footage to both files. And then while you're editing, it's using the small file to make everything nice and snappy. And when you export, it's using the big files to make everything look as high-res as possible. Audio recording levels, that's gonna be helpful when we're monitoring audio or whatever. And I have interval shoot function, which I also use sometimes to shoot time lapses. That's just, it makes it easy for me to find this. The only three things that I would really suggest you put in this menu is file format for video, movie settings for video, and then format the memory card. Everything else you can probably easily find. You're not going to be looking for it very often. And most of the stuff you're going to be accessing with this function button here. And I'll get to that in just one second. Okay, for this next section, I tried to think what would be best here. I mean, should I go through every single menu item? And I checked YouTube. There's already a great video by Potato Jet where he goes through every single item in the menu and tells you what it does. I'm just gonna link to that in the README file. If you're interested in learning what every single thing does, watch that video. I feel like he did a great job on that video. Instead, I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to start getting into button customization. And what I think that's going to do is allow me to teach you guys what the most important functions of this camera are, and I'll talk about them as I'm mapping them to each button. So I'm going to click the menu button here, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to the briefcase. And you can see here I can go to Operation Customize, and here we have custom key settings for stills, video, and then playback. And this is what I was talking about earlier. It gives you a lot of options to change the buttons depending on what mode the camera is in. And then we have function menu settings, which is this button right here, this FN button. And this is one of the most useful buttons on the entire camera. And I'm embarrassed to say with my GH5, I also had a similar button. I don't think I ever used it, but I have forced myself to learn it with this camera, and now I realize why it's so important. Let's first start with the custom key settings for still photography. Now, the reason you want to do this, even if you're a videographer and you're like, I don't really care about the still options here, is because you can set this camera up for still photography. And then when you go into the custom key settings for video, you can see that it says for most of these, follow custom for still photography. Whereas if you do this backwards and you set everything in the video section first, and then you want all the buttons to be similar with the still setting when you jump into that mode, you're gonna have to manually go in and set each one by one. I've made that mistake. It is a nightmare. I'm literally like taking photos of the menu with my camera and then trying to find everything. It's awful. So we're gonna start up here with the camera. The first change that I made, this is nothing that, I highly recommend if this feels uncomfortable to you, but I have changed the ISO from this button here. Normally you'd press the button and then you would rotate the knob. That just seems crazy to me. I'd much rather have an individual rotator knob for my shutter speed, my f-stop, and my ISO, and I don't want to have to press buttons to get it to work. I just want to be able to rotate and it work. So the first thing that I have number one set to is ISO. And just so you see, if I click this, if I click the center button here, this is where it gives you the options. And like I said, Sony has done an incredible job of making their menu system really intuitive. So when you slide down the side here, it will tell you what each thing is, and then you can jump into exposure, and then we can jump over to ISO there, click that, and boom, it's set. So now when I'm here, all I have to do is rotate this knob. If I go all the way down, it's gonna jump to auto, or I just rotate this and it works. I'm always filming myself like I am right now, and I'm always reaching around the camera and trying to change settings, and this makes things so much easier. So for me, this was huge. This was the first thing I did when I pulled this out of the box, but if you like pressing the button, feel free. Next up, auto exposure lock hold. That's what this button is already set to. I personally don't really like the placement of this button. I use auto exposure lock all the time when I'm taking still pictures, especially when I was a wedding photographer. I don't know if I'm gonna be using this. It's kind of uncomfortable for me to press, but for still photography, I couldn't think of anything else that I'd prefer there, so I'm just leaving that. AF on, I left that the same as well. This allows you to either use autofocus with the half press of the shutter button, or the AF on button can be used to engage autofocus when you're in manual focus. And this is incredibly helpful. So basically, if you put the camera in a manual focus, you'll focus by turning the focus ring. But sometimes you still want to rely on autofocus. You just don't want to rely on continuous autofocus. You don't want it to continue autofocusing after it's already locked on. So I'll leave the camera in manual focus, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But basically, I'll leave it in manual focus, and then I'll just hit the AF on button to focus. And then when I let go of it, it's locked, it's back in manual. It's not gonna move from there. Let's see, number 4 is C1. And I have this to autofocus / manual focus select toggle. So I'll show you how this works right now. So you can see here it says AFC, that's autofocus continuous. And if I press C1 right here, it's gonna jump into manual focus. Now I can turn this knob and you can see I can manually focus this myself, or I can press AF on and you can see here that these green boxes show up and this tells us where the camera is focusing. I'm gonna get much deeper into autofocus, but as you can see here, when I let go, it's just dropping back into manual focus and the camera's not going to do anything. But if I hit C1 again, it jumps back into autofocus continuous. And then when I put my hand here, you can see it's trying to autofocus for us here. And the reason why I love this camera so much, and I say that right as it's not going to focus on the camera anymore, you can see it's caught the edge of the of my placemat here. But the reason why I love this camera so much is because the autofocus is absolutely amazing, especially the face and eye autofocus, and we're gonna get to that in 1 second. But basically in this scenario where it's front focusing, it's like found a piece of focus right up here and it thinks like, that's good, I'm not gonna change it anymore. I have this camera set to autofocus tracking. So I can just touch where I want to focus and it's going to lock on. And now when I move the camera or if the subject moves, look at that box, follow that camera. I mean, how incredible is that? I'm gonna show you how to set that up in 1 second. And you can see here, tracking cancel is the circle, which is right in the middle here. So I'm just going to press that and it's canceling the tracking. Let's keep going here. Number 5 is C3. And I have this set to face and eye priority select. And this is going to toggle on and off eye priority. So if you're taking a video or a picture of something in a scene and a person walks through the background, it's going to lock onto their eye and it's going to focus onto their eye, even if your subject is in the foreground. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. 95% of the time, my foreground is my subject and it is a person. So I usually leave it on, but I love having it set to C3 here so I can easily toggle it on and off. And you can see here when I press this, right down here, AF on changes from on to off. And so when it's, you can leave it on all the time. Like there's no person in my scene right here with this camera. So I usually just leave it on all the time unless it becomes a problem. Number 6 is C4 or the trash can button down here. And this is touch operation select. I think maybe this is what the camera was set to. I don't know that I ever use this. Basically what it does is it just turns off the touch operation. So if for some reason you're bumping your touch screen and it's messing with the focus, you can easily turn that off. Personally, if I had another function that I needed, I would definitely get rid of that because I don't think I've ever used that once, but that's what it's set to. And we have more custom buttons to go to. So rear number 2 here. Number 1 is this little D-pad here, and you can press it in, and I have it set to switch focus area. And what this does is it's going to change the options for our focus area. I guess I'll just show you here. Right now it's set to wide, so it's looking at the entire screen. If I click it, you can see now it's set to zone, and I can use the D-pad to move this around. If I click again, it's going to be set to spot focus, and it's set back to wide. There are a ton of focus area options in this camera, and I have severely limited them so that I can quickly toggle through this without having to go into some menu. To limit what shows up with this button, go into your menu and go down to the autofocus, manual focus options here. And then we want to go down to focus area and focus area limit. And you can see here, this is where you can choose what will show up when you press this button. I have it set to only use wide, which is the entire screen, zone, which is a slightly smaller box that you can move around, and then spot. And so again, if I click here, it's going to go to zone, spot, I can move it around, click it again, it goes back to wide. Okay, number 2 is this middle button down here. This is kind of like the OK button, but if you're not in a menu, you can make it whatever you want. Right now, I don't have it set to anything. Feel free to set that to whatever you want. Number 3 is the drive mode, and I believe, yeah, drive mode is what it was set to normally. This is where you can set, you know, if you want it to be a single shot, or you want it to be like rapid fire shots, or you can also see it's got the symbol on there for the timer. So if you want to do a self-timer shot of yourself or do 2 seconds, whatever, that's the easiest way to get into it. And that's, your camera should be natively set there. Live view display select. So this is something, if you guys have never used a mirrorless camera before, how can I best explain this? Basically, as I'm changing my exposure, it's showing that on the screen, and the digital viewfinder is going to just replicate what the screen is. So if I, you know, raise my f-stop here, the scene's going to get darker. But when you change your settings in a standard DSLR where you're actually looking through a prism and looking through the lens, when you're clicking your f-stop, for example, it's not actually stopping down your lens yet. It's keeping it wide open so you can easily see through it. And then it's going to clamp down right as it takes a picture, and then it's going to open back up. This makes it easy for you to see through the camera, right? But one of the benefits of having a digital viewfinder and digital screen is that you can kind of see what you get, right? You don't need to look at your meter very often. You can just say, like, that looks like a correct exposure, I'm gonna shoot that or take a video of that. Until you start using strobe. So imagine you're in a studio environment and you want to darken the ambient light. So maybe you go up to your highest sync speed, that's like 1/200th of a second, and maybe you stop down to f11, and maybe you're at ISO 100 because you're about to, you know, fire a strobe. If you do that, if you do all those settings right here, I mean, if I start, you know, stopping down everything here, my scene is just going to go black, and it's going to look black in my viewfinder as well. So to show you this, I need to jump back into photo mode here. So I'm in manual now, and basically you can see I've stopped everything down and it looks almost black. You can't even see what's going on anymore. And then imagine if I took a picture, a strobe would fire and it would give me a correct exposure, but I can't set up my shot here because everything's black. So I have ISO now set to toggle live view on and off. And I find myself using this all the time when I'm shooting photos, but I never use it ever when I'm shooting video. Obviously, you can't use strobe with video. You want your video to look like what's on the back of the screen. So this is one of those buttons that I'm going to change when we get into video mode. Now, one thing that to me is not intuitive at all about this menu is this setting, because I would assume that this would show up under the you know, touch operation or finder/monitor. It seems like it should be there, but instead, I believe it's under the camera all the way at the bottom, shooting display. And it's then grid line, and then live view display set. So if you're looking for that, it's hidden there. Sony, that makes no sense. Put it under the display settings. But other than that, everything else should be pretty intuitive. All right, number 5 here is the bottom. This is something that drives me crazy personally, but you may love. When you take this out of the box, there's a little sensor here that when you hold the camera up to your eye, it's going to automatically switch the view from the screen to the electronic viewfinder. Since I shoot video most of the time, it drives me absolutely crazy. I'm always doing stuff, you know, I'm like putting microphones on top of the camera, I'm putting the camera on a gimbal or something, and stuff is always going in front of this little sensor and cutting off my screen, and it absolutely drives me mad. So instead, I have set it to manually switch with this button here. So I am going to set this back to normal mode. And you can see here, when I press this down, I know you guys can't see inside here, but the screen's turning on here, and then when I press it down again, it turns the monitor on there. So that makes it really easy for me to jump between these two and never have it turn off without me wanting it to. Up top, we have this record button, and I've set that to stay where it is out of the box. Movie shooting, it just starts recording. C2 up here, I don't remember what it was set to out of the box, but for me personally, Nikon cameras always have white balance up there, or maybe my Panasonic, I don't know. I'm just accustomed to white balance being up there. So I have C2 set to white balance, so you can see I can just press C2, jump between white balance. At the top here, it's auto. And then as I tick down here, you can go through all the manual settings. When I get to Kelvin, I can hit right and it's gonna move over. This is our color temperature. And then if you move over right again, this gives you the ability to fine tune your exposure. So basically, if you want to add green or magenta, this is different than your color temperature. This is how you do it here. So I find myself doing this all the time. The last option here is this function button that's on some Sony lenses. I don't even own any lenses that have this. If you want to change it, feel free. I think it's normally set to focus hold. I will never use that. So we have now set the camera up for stills mode. Now we can check out our video settings. And you can see that for the most part, I've left everything the same. You wouldn't want all of your buttons to completely change, right? So number one's the same. As you can see, number two here is the exposure lock button. I never use exposure lock when I'm shooting video. I'm either in some sort of semi-automatic shooting mode and I want the exposure to fluctuate, or I'm shooting in manual probably 99% of the time and I just want it locked. So I never use that. I have set it to gamma display assist. And what this does is some of the color profiles for shooting video that we're gonna talk about in a second shoot this incredibly flat profile, this log. And it's very difficult to tell what a correct exposure is. And so you can toggle this on and off and it kind of gives the footage a little bit more of a normal look. So I have it set to that button and it makes it quick and easy to toggle that on and off. As you can see, everything else here on that first page is the same. Number three, monitor brightness. So number three is normally the drive mode. Again, this is where we could set from like single shot to multi-consecutive shooting or set the timer. Well, obviously I don't do that when I'm in video mode. None of that even makes any sense. So I have it set to monitor brightness, and this allows me to press this button here. And you can see it went into drive mode because I'm in shooting mode still. So I'm going to toggle this to video mode. Now when I hit the button, it's going to go into monitor brightness. And you can see here I can drop down to sunny weather. And that's just going to make my screen much brighter. I do find it a little harder to get a correct exposure when this is set to sunny weather. So I only put it in sunny weather if I'm really having a hard time seeing it. Normally I just leave it in manual there, but again, it's something to just easily get to. Number four is the ISO button, and I have that set to picture profile. Now remember, when I am in stills mode, I have that set to the live view setting. So is it gonna show me kind of what my exposure is, or is it just going to try to make a correct exposure regardless of my camera settings? That makes no sense when you're shooting video. So I have not used that there, and instead I have set it to picture profile. And picture profiles here, you can see if I hit this button here, I can cycle between all of these different picture profiles, and you can see it's completely changing the way our footage looks here. We'll talk a little bit more about this coming up. But for me personally, I like shooting in PP11, which is the a7sIII. This just recently came out, and I think it's just easy. You don't have to deal with all the crazy log stuff and filming with a really washed out look and doing tons of edits later. I like easy. This is easy, and it looks great. And with the last two, we have the exact same settings here as still photography. Now, we could go into the playback option and we could change, what buttons do here. I don't find that I'm doing that much stuff with playback. So for me personally, I didn't need to customize anything with playback, but that's where you do it there. Now, the function menu settings may be one of the most important things that you can customize. And this can take a little bit of time because there's lots of options in here, as you can see. And this is where I did almost completely different settings for my still shooting, which is up top here. and my bottom, which is video. And you can see that by the little picture of the mountain up there that represents photo, and then the video clip down here. So basically, because I'm in video mode right now, if I click the function button, it's going to bring up these options in this function menu. And then if I click over to the still shooting mode and I click the function button, it's going to bring up other options down here. Let's go back into the menu, and I'm just going to go through this one by one and try to explain to you why I chose these. So this is a little bit redundant, and it's up to you if you want to place redundant things like on a button in the function menu and in the star my menu option in the main menu. For me personally, some of these things are so frustrating to find, especially for somebody who isn't accustomed to my camera, that I just put some stuff in here multiple times, especially with Patrick. Like, I'm kind of more into these new Sony cameras than he is. He's my business partner, in case you don't know. And so he picks these up and he just gets infuriated because he doesn't know what all these C numbers are. So I've put some of the stuff that's behind buttons also in the function menu, and I'll try to explain why. So anytime I cycle around here, you can see what it is right up here. So this is the live view display. So this is the same button that I had set to ISO when I was in the standard still shooting mode. And this just, in case Patrick doesn't know it's under the ISO button, because that's not intuitive, you'd have to memorize it. I'm just putting it in the function menu as well. Down here, flash mode. This is going to give you the option to move between things like, front curtain shooting. You can see fill flash here, slow sync, rear sync. But again, this is something that, of course, you wouldn't ever need in the video function, right? You can't shoot video with flashes. So that's something that we don't need in the video. Next up, we have shutter type. This is something that's incredibly helpful for wedding photographers. Most current cameras have the ability to shoot with a mechanical clicking shutter or with a digital shutter where nothing moves at all, and it's basically just kind of like taking a video clip from the sensor. If you're in a situation where you don't want your camera clicking, like I was all the time when, maybe you're shooting a ceremony or something at a wedding, I want to be able to quickly jump in and turn my mechanical shutter off. Keep in mind that you will get slightly better performance out of the mechanical shutter, and you'll be able to sync flash with the mechanical shutter. So you can't have a silent camera and shoot with flash. Otherwise, I'd probably just leave the camera in silent mode all the time if I could use it with flash. Right below that, you can see I have an option for silent mode. Again, that's going to turn on and off beeping sounds, depending on if you like that. This is kind of the wedding photographer in me, just wanting to be able to find that easily. Focus area, this is going to just give us a few more options rather than pressing the button on the back that we had mapped everything to. RAW versus JPEG, this is the file format. So usually I just leave my camera set to RAW plus JPEG. It just gives me options. I know a lot of photographers exclusively leave it set to RAW. I shoot JPEGs all the time. Sometimes I just like grabbing something and throwing it online and without dealing with Photoshop or whatever. So that's up to you, but I'm always changing it, so I wanted it to be easily accessible. Metering modes, this is going to determine, if you're using matrix metering and it's looking at the entire scene to try to figure out what your meter should be, or is it looking at a spot, or is it looking at someone's face? Next up is steady shot. This is the camera's stabilization. You can turn it on normal or active. I leave it on active all the time, and just so you guys know, when you have it in active, it's cropping into the sensor a little bit and you're losing a little bit of resolution. Especially when you're shooting with video, it's like cropping in a little bit and kind of moving around to counteract your movement. But the footage looks amazing. I think it's definitely worth any loss in resolution. I certainly can't see it. And finally, I have prioritize record media. This is really for people who, I guess, shoot with multiple cards, and I don't know why you'd be switching back and forth between like card 1 or card 2 should be the primary, but this was already in the menu and I thought I would leave it. And then I actually ended up deleting some other ones out. I'm sure in the future I'll probably find something else that I want to add in there. And so I just have those open right now. All right, moving on to the function menu here. The first two that I have on the left are focus peaking. So peaking level and then peaking display. Peaking display is just turning focus peaking on and off. And then peaking level is the amount of focus peaking. And basically what this does is it will show you what is in focus by putting a little border around it. Sometimes I want that on, sometimes I want it off. And so this makes it really quick and easy for me to find that. Zebra levels I'm using all the time, and I can see on this camera that's recording me the windows that are behind me. I'm seeing the zebra stripes behind me right here. Let me just show you what this looks like. If I start overexposing this scene and I turn zebras on, and I guess I can give you a quick zebra lesson here. Depending on what picture profile you're in, you can set these zebras to show up at different points in your exposure. So right now I have it set to 100 plus. So basically it's going to show me anything that's overexposed, anything that's beyond white. It's going to put these black bars, especially when you're in bright sunlight and it's really hard to tell if you're getting a correct exposure on your screen or not. If I can just tell what's blown out, that's enough. Usually if you're shooting somebody's face and you start seeing zebras on their face, you know they're overexposed because nobody's skin is pure white. So you shouldn't be getting pure white on somebody's face. You can see here as I darken this exposure up, all the zebras will go away. The only zebras that are showing up are right on the top of the camera there, which is just a reflection that's coming on the top of that camera. You can see I can hide that and the zebras will go away. Next up, we have autofocus transition options here. The first one is autofocus transition speed, and the bottom one is autofocus subject shift sensitivity. Now, if you're shooting stills, you'd want as fast as autofocus as you can get, but when you're shooting video, sometimes you want slower, more natural feeling smooth autofocus, especially when it's transitioning from a foreground to a background or something like that. So autofocus subject shift sensitivity is if your subject leaves the scene, how quickly does it immediately like lock onto that background? I like that to be a little bit slower. And then the top one here, autofocus transition speed, is just how quickly it's going to autofocus. So if you tap on the background and then tap on my face, how quickly does it rack focus from the background to my face? Mess with this yourself. I'm not going to tell you what's right. It really depends on what type of video you're doing. Obviously, with me sitting right here, I would imagine this camera is locked onto my eye right now, and it's probably never going to miss. So autofocus speed doesn't really matter at all. But if you're jumping between subjects, being able to mess with that can be helpful. Next up is priority set in auto white balance. I don't know that I'm really going to use this. This is just one of these things that I think was already there, so I left it. But basically what you can do is you can tell it how accurate do you want the auto white balance to be. Most of the time I'm shooting with locked off Kelvin white balance, so I don't even use auto white balance, but you can have it set to where it tries to make anything that's white actually white and kill the mood in the scene. Or if you're in like a really warm environment, maybe you're like shooting inside at night with incandescent light bulbs, it could keep a little bit of that yellow tone. So that option will be there for you. As you can see here, I've got steady shot. This allows you to easily toggle it on or off. I leave it on all the time. I leave it on active all the time, even when I'm on a tripod. Everybody says you shouldn't. You should turn it off when you're on tripod for the highest quality or whatever. But so far, I haven't seen the camera shifting around or anything, and it's just easier for me to leave it on. But sometimes when I'm doing shots with like a gimbal or maybe a slider, sliders especially, something that I know is very locked off, when it starts moving, sometimes the camera sensor will get confused and it'll start jumping around and it'll wreck the footage. So I want to be able to turn that off in that scenario. Next up, I have grid line display, which is probably something I'll never use. It just adds lines across your image to help you line everything up. Next up, audio record level. This is something that I choose all the time. And usually when I'm recording audio externally, like I've got wireless microphones plugged into that camera over there, I have this set to around 6. But as you can see, when I'm talking right now, my levels are really low with the internal mic on this camera here. So I think natively it's set to like 26. Keep in mind that even if your audio is super low and you just leave this at like 6 all the time, usually you're just going to be using this audio to sync with better audio. And I have sometimes this audio is so low that you can't even see the lines moving, but I have no problem in Premiere boosting this audio up and getting plenty of audio back to do the syncing. So a lot of times I'm just always leaving this at 6. Okay, last but certainly not least, this one's very important and a little bit confusing. This is the mode for the video function. Now, remember up here on this dial that we have ASMP and auto. All of these are shooting modes for the still camera. But if you want to move into any of the semi-automatic modes when shooting video, you can't do it with this knob. You have to do it in the menu, and that's very strange. It's kind of weird. I wish Sony would let you swap this out, because most people bought this camera to be a video camera, so I don't know why you can't use this knob. But you can see here, I'm in video mode. I can hit function, and then I can go over to a mode here. I'm in manual right now, which would be like M if I were up here in the still mode. But this is where I can move to shutter priority, aperture priority, or program mode. Again, 99% of the time I'm in manual, but sometimes I will jump into a semi-automatic mode, and that's how you have to do it. So I hate having to find that in the menu, and that's why I put it in the function. While we're in this customization setting here, let's just go ahead and knock this out. We'll go through everything real quick. Different set for still versus movie. Let's say you're at a wedding and you're jumping between stills and video. If you were shooting natural light stills and then natural light video, then you'd want all of your settings to be the same. But if you're jumping between natural light video and then strobe photography, it's going to be very slow for you to change those settings every time you jump between those modes. So in that situation only, I think, you'd want to come in here and you'd want to say, set each one of these different, because when I jump from photo and video mode, I don't want my aperture to be the same. I want it to be where I left it. For me personally, I'm not shooting weddings with this, and so I find myself being in video mode all the time and then wanting to snap a quick raw photo, and I jump into still mode, and I find it incredibly frustrating when all of the settings change. So for me personally, I have all of these off, but if you're going to be jumping from natural light to strobe light, then you may want to turn these on. Okay, display, screen display set. This basically gives you the options of what will show up when you hit this display button on the back of the camera and you cycle through everything. So I'm in the video mode right now. You can see I've got all this information around my screen here. When I hit display, it's going to turn off that. I'm going to hit it again. It's going to give me the histogram. I'm going to hit it again. It's going to give me my level. I'm going to hit it again, and it brings everything back. And so when I go into this menu, everything is here. Now, the only thing that I don't have turned on is monitor off. And what that would do is when I would hit display one final time, the monitor would turn off. I personally can't think of any reason why I would want to do that. And then the other option here for Viewfinder, basically it's asking, do you want all of this stuff to show up when you hit display, when your eye is in the digital viewfinder as well? I personally do. And then Finder is the viewfinder. We can come in and we can change all this as well. Display all info. I have that turned off because I think it goes over the top of my pictures. I find it a little bit annoying, but you can turn that on. And histogram level and stuff, you can get that to show up by hitting the display button as well. Next up, we have record with shutter. And as far as I know, this only works when you're in video mode. And when this is set to on, you can press either the record button or the shutter button to record video. Now, in a perfect world, I would like to be in video mode, and when I hit the record button, I want it to record a video, and when I hit the shutter button, I want it to take a raw photo. I cannot figure out how to do that. I've asked people on the Sony forum, and nobody seems to know how to get it to do that, so maybe it can't do that. When you're in stills mode and you hit record, it will record and take photos independently. You can't do them at the same time. But if you're in like manual mode and I click the shutter button, it will take a photo. And if I click the record button, it will take a video mode. So you might be asking, well then, why not just leave it in photo mode all the time and then you can do either? Well, the problem with that is the aspect ratio of a still image and like the size of the sensor is a 3:2 sensor. But of course, 4K video is 16:9. There's also some like other options that you can change in the camera that change, like it'll zoom in digitally just a little bit when you're shooting video. So basically you'll frame up a shot in still mode and then you'll hit record and it'll like punch in a little bit. And so for that reason, I find it a little bit annoying to shoot video out of the stills mode, but you can do it. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm not currently using the 1, 2, 3 customized dial up here on the top, but if you wanted to edit this, you can cycle directly into it here and it'll give you options. Or if you want to go into your menu, I think that this should probably be under the button option down here in the toolbox or the briefcase or whatever, but they have hidden it under the camera. Under number 4, shooting mode, you can go over to camera set memory, and then you can see here 1, 2, and 3, and it gives you all the options for this setting. And then you can cycle over to 2 and then 3. It's not changing because I haven't set them. And then if you cycle down here, you can see literally everything in the camera you can turn on or off or customize. And then M1 through 4 can be saved on a memory card. So if you want to save one of these settings and then move it over to another camera, you can easily do that without changing all of the settings in this camera. All right, so I think you have a pretty basic understanding of my button layout and the button customization and everything. Now let's take a little bit deeper dive into the menu. I'm just gonna go over the most important stuff that you need to know in the menu. We're not gonna go over everything. And then after we do that, we can get into just a little bit of shooting details and editing details and stuff when we get into post. Let's first come to the camera. We'll first go to the camera and then number 3, which is file, and then file settings here. Basically, this is where you're gonna go in the menu if you have multiple of the same camera and you want to be able to keep everything separate. What I've done with other cameras that we've had in the past, I go to like Marshalls or something and get these stickers that are numbers or letters, and they're black, and you can stick them on the camera and you can't really see them or anything, but you can see them just enough to know that like this is my A camera and that's my B camera and that's my C camera and my D camera. And then I come in here and I name the files based on the letter or the number of the camera. And that makes it really, really easy to figure out which camera you need for what. I usually try to use my number 1 camera or my A camera as my main camera. And then it just is much faster when you're pulling things into Premiere and stuff, you know where it should go without even looking at it. Under number 8 here, image stabilization, you can see that it gives you an option for focal length. And remember that this camera has sensor stabilization. So the sensor itself is moving around opposite to the way you're moving the camera. Most lenses tell the camera their focal length, and then the camera knows how much to compensate for that movement. But if you've got an older or some sort of modified lens, you can come in here and manually put in the focal length, and then with an old mechanical lens or one that doesn't talk to the body, you can still get stabilization. You just have to put the correct focal length in there. All of my lenses are totally up to date, so I don't think that's anything that I will ever use. Moving down to the exposure and color tab here. Under exposure, you'll notice that there are a lot of different things for exposure compensation. You're also going to notice that in the function menu and stuff, there's a lot of stuff with exposure compensation that I don't fully understand because there is a mechanical exposure compensation knob right here. So you simply push this button to unlock it, and then you can change the exposure comp here, which makes a lot more sense to me than trying to do it digitally. So if there's something that I'm missing and you want to go into the menu, that's where it is, but I would highly suggest you just use the physical button here. Under number 3 is these metering options here, and usually I just leave it in metering mode, multi, which is kind of looking at the entire scene. But then we also have face priority in multi mode, and what it's doing, I mean, the camera's amazing at picking out faces, and then it's going to create a correct exposure for the face rather than the scene. So right now, I've got this crazy white background behind me. That could confuse a camera normally, but if you leave face priority on, then hopefully it'll do a little bit better job for you. Under 5, number 5 here says color tone. You can change this D range optimizer, and you can add picture profiles and creative looks and stuff to still images. Anything that you do in camera can easily be done in post, and you're not getting a better result by doing it in camera. So everyone I've heard from online says to not use those features. All right, moving on to the focus tab here. I think we've talked about most of this stuff. Face and eye autofocus on. Face and eye subject human. I think it should normally be set to human. You can set it to animal, which is kind of crazy. I don't really shoot animals, so I haven't tested that, but I hear it works really well. Right and left eye, that's going to, actually choose which eye it focuses on. I would leave that on auto, and the camera does a great job of focusing on whichever eye is closest to the camera, which is what you'd always want. Face/eye frame display on. This one is off normally, and this is wildly important to me. I'm always so paranoid with autofocus. Like, is this actually working? And the screen's really small. Can't really tell what's going on. When you have this set to on, it will make a box around someone's face, and then it will actually put a box on their eye. And I can barely see the box. I mean, the camera's kind of far away from me recording right now, but I can barely see it on my eye. And it just gives me the peace of mind to know that, hey, it sees my eye and it is actually focusing on my eye. And then when I'm ever in a weird, dark situation or whatever, and I'm letting autofocus do its thing, and that box disappears, I know that the camera is probably losing focus. Without that box on, I don't know how you can tell, if it's in focus or not. So I think it's kind of silly that Sony turns that off. You definitely want that to be on. Next up is registered faces priority. I don't really get this, but apparently this camera can register different faces. You can take a picture of somebody, upload it into the memory of this camera, and then if that person shows up in one of your frames, it'll be like, that's the most important person, focus on that person, which is kind of crazy. It's incredible, but I'm trying to think of any situation where I would want that. Maybe if you're like a paparazzi and you're like, today I'm going to get Tom Cruise and I only want to focus on Tom Cruise's face. But other than that, you would just frame Tom Cruise in the frame and then it would lock on his face. Or you do the touch tracking like I talked about earlier, and that would do everything you need. So I don't think I'm going to be registering faces, but I've left it on. All right, under the network tab here, and under number 1, transfer and remote control with smartphone. This may sound kind of gimmicky to you, but I have to tell you, I use this all the time, and it has been really fantastic. In fact, I'm using it right now. If you can see myself on my iPad here, this is how I'm kind of monitoring myself here. So I accidentally touched the screen when I picked it up there, and you can actually focus by touching on the iPad or your phone, which is pretty crazy. I find myself using this to monitor myself. I can start and stop. I can change the camera settings. I was just out at the park the other day with this camera, and I was taking portraits of my family, and I wanted to be in some of the shots. And at first, I was setting the camera to 10 seconds timer, and then I was like running back and forth between the camera, and I remembered, oh yeah, I can control it with my cell phone. So I got my cell phone connected, and then I just would hit the button and then hide it, set it to like 2 seconds and hide it in my pocket or whatever. And it was so much easier. So it seems gimmicky, but I use this all the time. You're going to want the Imaging Edge app, and you can click here to control with smartphone. And control with smartphone needs to be turned on, and then always connected. You can turn that off and it'll save power. I leave it on just because I'm always using this feature. But depending on whether you use it or not, you'll definitely want to turn it on for the sake of battery life. And then when you click on connection here, what it does is it creates this little QR code, and you simply hold the app up with your phone to this QR code. Your camera starts producing its own Wi-Fi network, and the camera automatically connects to it, and then it just works. It's so rare that it just works. With our old Nikon cameras, you were supposed to be able to connect, and with our Panasonics, you're supposed to be able to connect, but just all of a sudden it'll just stop connecting, and it's an absolute nightmare. And if you can't rely on it, then I just never use it. But with this app, it has been 100% reliable, so I highly suggest using it. The send to smartphone or the sending target here, you can choose what files you want to send over to your phone or your iPad as you're taking pictures. If you just want low-res shots, you can just tell it to send proxy files over only, or if you want it to send the original files, you can get it to send the raw files over to your phone or iPad, and then you can edit them directly from there. Depending on what you want, you can change that. I have it set to original because I think recently I actually was like doing full edits on my iPad like this. FTP transfer and PC remote function. I haven't gotten deep into this, but if you want to be able to control your camera through a network, through a computer, and transfer everything through FTP and stuff, you can go down a crazy deep rabbit hole there. I will not be doing that. Under dial customization, this is where you could go in and you could change like the direction of scrolling. So if you wanted to like turn to the right and you want your aperture to get wider or vice versa, you could come in here and do that. I didn't need to do that for anything. Touch operation. This is very important to me personally. I think normally this might be set to just touch to focus, but it won't actually track the subject. And so it makes it so much easier, in my opinion, when touching focuses and tracks. And then you can just set standard focusing with a focus point with this D-pad on the back like I talked about earlier. The last thing that I want to mention here down at number 11 is external output. This probably will never be an issue for you, but as somebody who does tutorials and stuff, I'm always hunting for this. You can change your HDMI output settings. And one of those settings could be, do you want the HDMI output to show exactly what's on this screen, or do you want it to be a clean feed? So I actually was expecting to record my screen with a separate Atomos recorder. And so for that reason, I had to come in here and set it so that all of my settings would show up on my Atomos. I decided not to do that because some stuff doesn't show up. Long story, but basically, if you want to be able to swap between that, or if you want to do like really high quality raw external recording with certain external recorders through HDMI, this is where you're going to come in and find that. All right, guys, that wraps up everything that I know about the functions and the button layout on this camera. The next thing I want to talk about are just a few more of the details that go into actually shooting video, picture profiles, LUTs, exposing, focusing, stuff like that. So let's get to it. All right, guys, I've gotten my wife to sit in for me here, and I am recording the back of my a7sIII so that we can kind of go through my thought process and my setup for focusing and exposing and stuff like that. It is recording right now. You can see the record lighting up down here, and you can also see the red square. I've turned that on as an option as well in the menu, just so that I always know when I'm actually recording. Let's just quickly go through and I'll tell you what everything on the screen means. M up here means that we are in video mode. That's a little video symbol, and we are in manual shooting mode. We can see that we have one memory card and we have 3 hours and 55 minutes of record time left on this card. We're shooting in HAVCS 4K, and we're shooting in 24 frames per second, 100 megabits per second, 420 at 8-bit. So this is a lower quality setting. We'll change that in a second. Battery life, obviously. The hand is saying that we have stabilization on. Over here, you'll see this little touchscreen button with like a finger and a swipe motion. This is telling us that we have that touch to track button on. So if I touch the background right now, you can see it's going to focus on that background. And if I move the camera, it's going to keep that focus point right on the edge of that curtain there. When I turn this off by hitting the center button here, it's going to jump to her face automatically, and then it's going to find her eye, because we have autofocus turned on, which is right down here. You can see here we have the camera connected with Wi-Fi to a cell phone. So that's letting us know that we can connect wirelessly. This over here is our metering mode. It's in matrix metering, which is looking at the entire scene. That's why it's telling us right now down here that we are one stop overexposed, but that's only because we've got these two really bright windows in the background. So correct exposure for this scene is going to be 1 stop overexposed. Down here, we've got our color temperature, 4900 Kelvin, and then it also gives us our magenta shift of 2. Dynamic range booster is turned off. This is our picture profile 11. I'm going to talk about this in a second. Then we have our standard camera settings down here. This, of course, is my audio signal. I have this plugged in with a little mic up top here. And we are in a wide focusing mode. And then above that, we are in autofocus continuous. Now, because I'm recording, if I hit C3, this is the face autofocus on. It's not going to do anything while I'm recording, but if we weren't recording, I'd be able to cycle this on and off. I can hit C1 though, and I can jump over to manual focus. So because it was focused on her eye and I jumped into manual focus, it's basically just locked right now. If I press the autofocus on button, you can see it's going to show a green square where it's focusing. So it's still finding her eye there and focusing on her eye. I can click this button in and I can change my focus area to zone, or I could change it to center fixed here or spot, and I can move this. Like let's say I wanted to focus on this curtain up here. If I hit autofocus on now, it's going to focus on that background and not on her face because it's only looking in that square. I'm gonna click this again. It's gonna go back to wide, and then when I hit autofocus, it should find her eye again because eye autofocus is on. All right, let's quickly look at the picture profiles here. If I click the ISO button, because that's where we have it mapped, it's going to show us our picture profiles. Now, right now, I'm in picture profile 11, and if you hit right again, it'll take you into it, and you can see this is a7sIII, and you can come in here and you can fine tune this. Let's go back. One thing that's a little confusing with this camera is that many of these color profiles have different native ISOs. And the other thing that's confusing is that although this camera claims that it doesn't have dual native ISOs, it kind of does. If you look at this chart here, you can see the different color profiles, and the lower ISO number will give you the cleanest result. And then as you stop up from there, it's going to get grainier and grainier until it hits that second ISO number. So basically, in a perfect world, stick with the lower number. And then if you must go up higher by a few stops, it's better to just go ahead and jump to that second higher number. My suggestion for you, and for the simplicity of this video, I only shoot with 3 of these. So the first one being picture profile off, and this is going to be a very contrasty, vibrant image. It's probably too contrasty for many of you. And then the other one I use, which is probably the best one, is PP8. And if we look in here, it is a gamma of S log 3. And an S-gamut3.cine color mode. If you're willing to put up with the hassle of looking at this incredibly washed out looking shot here, this is going to give you the absolute best quality. Now, the key to this color profile is that the base ISO is actually 640 for this profile. So you'll get the best quality at 640 ISO. The other thing that you need to consider is that you are supposed to overexpose this by 1 to 2 stops. And the camera, as you can see, stops metering once you get to 2 stops. And because this scene is so backlit here, this can be a problem because maybe we need to overexpose this scene by 3 stops because of those really bright windows in the background, and we can't easily see that. So the other way that you can fix this is by going in here to your function menu and going to your zebras, and we can set our zebras manually, and everyone online says approximately 55 with a plus or minus of 1. And then we hit OK on that, and as long as we can see zebras on our subject's face, then we know that it is correctly exposed. Basically, you don't want to super underexpose or overexpose somebody's face. The problem with this system is that everybody's skin tone is a little bit different. So this isn't the most accurate. The most accurate way to do this would be to walk around with a gray card, but this is one option for you to do this. The other thing to remember is that if you're going to be shooting in S-Log3, you really want to be shooting in 10-bit. That's going to give you the best image quality when you're editing this file, because you need to take this washed out looking footage and then bring it back to a computer and edit it. So you need to choose some sort of file type that is 10-bit. Right now I'm shooting in only 8-bit. So in a second I'm going to take you on a computer and I'm going to show you how to edit these files. I'm going to shoot with a 10-bit file for that video. But I rarely shoot in this color profile just because I hate looking at this. It's so washed out and difficult to see. So there's a middle ground, and for me that is PP11. And you can see it's overexposed now because I had it overexposed for the previous color profile. So I'm going to drop down my ISO back to a correct exposure, which is there. I also need to fix my zebras here because they're set to that weird number here. I'm going to set the zebras back to 100 plus. So that's just showing me exactly what is beyond pure white and is blowing out, which is those windows, which is correct. All right, so that's everything that I wanted to show you about actually filming with this camera. Let me take you onto the computer and show you how to edit some of these video files. All right, guys, we are here in Premiere and we have this 10-bit file here, which is going to give us the absolute best color to work with. When you start pushing and pulling colors, that's when you're going to start seeing it break down. Usually everyone exports to 8-bit, but if you're going to be really editing it and you want the best quality, you want to be shooting in 10-bit. Make sure that you have your lumetri scopes on, and this is going to help you see the colors and tones and everything. And when you reach beyond 100, you're blowing out, and when you reach below 0, you're going to be crushing everything beyond black here. As you can see, everything in our scene is kind of crunched up in the middle, and that's the nature of this picture profile. We're going to spread it out. The first way we're going to do it, I'm going to show you how to do it manually, and then I'm going to show you the more professional way, which is to use a LUT. So the first thing I'm going to do, I like going into curves, and I just like pushing the whites and the blacks to get them down to the bottom here. And you can see when it starts crunching up along the bottom, we're losing all of that data. So I just want it to barely touch down there. And we're going to do the same thing for the whites. And then I can choose to create curves here. If I wanted to add contrast, I can start pulling down this way and pushing up a little bit here in the highlights. I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go back up to basic correction. Let's go to creative, and I'm going to add some saturation and some vibrance. And if we wanted to come in and tweak individual colors and stuff, we could, but for the most part, I think this is looking pretty good. Now, there's this guy on YouTube, his name's Gerald Undone. He does incredibly detailed testing, and he made a video that kind of explains why doing it the way I just did may not be the most accurate. I'm going to show you how to do this with Sony Luts next, but I just want you guys to realize that I have seen the most horrific footage ever online, but people think it's good because they shot in a flat profile, and so they think that makes their footage look good. And they are blinded by the fact that it actually looks horrible for any number of reasons. So if it looks good to you, that's all that matters. We're not trying to make things accurate. We're trying to make things look good. But if we want to do it the most professional way, I'm going to go ahead and just copy this here. So this one here is what I just did manually, and then this one here is the same clip. Now, included in the file, I included some Sony Luts that are free off of Sony's website. I just threw them in the file to make it easier for you guys so you don't have to find it. But I'm just going to browse to that, and I'm going to click on this first one here, which converts S-Log3 to 709. And you can see this gets us pretty close here to a correct exposure. So now we can start kind of pushing and pulling and try to get this looking a little bit better. I think this looks a little bit overexposed to me. So we want our whites to be up there. And you can see here we've still got a little ways to go with our shadows, so we could push our shadows down like that. And then maybe the whole shot is a little muted, so I like adding a little bit of saturation and a little bit of vibrance. And I think that looks pretty good. Now, when I'm looking at the one I did manually, I'm liking the detail better that's in the windows and the back. And something about this LUT has just destroyed. You can see the blue up here that's showing up in the windows is just crushed for some reason with the LUT. And I don't know how to get that back. Like, it's just not there. So this is another example of why I just feel like when everybody becomes such a stickler and a pixel peeper and says you have to do it a certain way, I just don't know that in this case it looks better. I think it actually just looks worse, and I don't know how to recover that window. And so for that reason, it might just be easier to do this manually. If you want to go down the LUT route, absolutely go for it. If you want to do the manual route, go for it. Or if you're like me and you kind of hate shooting flat profiles, just don't. Just shoot cool footage and no one will ever know or care. All right, guys, that wraps up this tutorial. Hopefully you have learned a lot. It's taken me literally months to learn everything that I put into this video. This camera can be incredibly frustrating to learn, but once you get over the hump, it's totally worth it. This is by far my favorite video camera ever, and I think if you put the time in, give it some practice, I think you're gonna fall in love with it too. In case you haven't already, check out the README file that came along with this video. I linked to a couple of other great videos that are on YouTube that go much deeper than I did on a few different subjects. And if you're interested in learning more about photography or videography, head over to fstoppers.com/store to check out our full-length photography tutorials.